She spent 30 years caring for her paralyzed husband, until she uncovered a secret that changed everything. Clara Whitaker had long since resigned herself to the quiet rhythm of her life. The house she shared with her husband Daniel was still beautiful, a large old home in the suburbs with ivy crawling up the brick exterior. On the surface it was a peaceful existence. The windows were large, offering a constant stream of sunlight that filled the rooms with a soft golden glow. There was a garden outside where Clara would often spend her mornings tending to flowers and vegetables, as though the act of nurturing them would somehow restore balance to her life. But beneath the surface everything had changed. It had been 20 years since the accident. 20 years since Daniel had been paralyzed from the waist down in a car crash. He was only 38 at the time. Clara was 36, and their life had been full of promise, dreams, and aspirations. But the crash had shattered all that. In the blink of an eye, Daniel's life was turned upside down, and so too was Clara's. Her role as his caretaker had begun gradually. At first, the physical therapy, the doctor's visits, the daily tasks were all things they could manage together. She was his partner in every sense. But over time, as his dependence on her deepened, Clara's own life slowly faded into the background. The line between wife and caregiver blurred until it was almost indistinguishable. She hadn't had a proper night's sleep in years. Every night she would get up multiple times to adjust him, make sure he was comfortable, or simply check that he was still breathing. His body, once strong and full of life, was now heavy, unresponsive, requiring constant attention. And while Daniel's mind was sharp as ever, his spirit seemed to have dimmed after the accident. He had always been independent, a man of action, but now he seemed to float in a kind of limbo, stuck in a life he never wanted. He rarely complained, but Clara could see the sadness in his eyes, a sadness that grew over the years. In the early days, Clara had told herself that their love would survive this. She had promised herself that despite the challenges they would find a way to be happy again. But as the years went on, happiness had become a distant memory. Their marriage had become more of a partnership out of necessity than anything else. Clara's dreams, once vibrant and full of possibility, had been put on hold. She hadn't even realized how much of herself she had sacrificed until now. She had lost touch with old friends. She hadn't had time for socializing in years. There were no more weekend getaways, no more spontaneous trips to the beach or nights out at restaurants. Her world had become small, revolving around Daniel and his needs. Every conversation, every decision was about him, about what would make his life easier, more comfortable. She had become a nurse, a therapist, a chef, a driver, a housekeeper, but never just a wife, and Daniel, for his part, seemed to have accepted this new dynamic. But Clara wondered sometimes if he even remembered what it was like before the accident. The late-night talks, the passion, the dreams they had shared. She remembered when they had met. Daniel had been full of energy, a go-getter, someone who never sat still for long. He had a smile that lit up the room, and Clara had been drawn to him immediately. They had been inseparable, partners in everything. And then, overnight, that all disappeared. The accident had changed him, but Clara had changed too. She had grown weary, both physically and emotionally. Her once vibrant personality was now subdued, as if the years of caregiving had slowly eroded her sense of self. One evening, as Clara was preparing dinner, she noticed Daniel sitting in his wheelchair by the window, staring out at the garden. The silence between them had become a constant companion, and she wasn't sure when it had first settled in. It wasn't the silence of comfort, the kind of quiet that existed between two people who had long since stopped needing to speak because they simply understood each other. It was the silence of distance, the kind that only grew when two people were no longer truly connected. "Daniel," Clara said softly, breaking the silence, "what are you thinking about?" He didn't turn to face her. His eyes were fixed on the garden, his expression distant. "Just wondering," he muttered, "wondering what could have been." Clara's heart twisted in her chest. She had heard these kinds of remarks before. They had become more frequent over the years, those moments when Daniel would drift off, lost in thoughts of the life he could have had. He didn't need to say it aloud for Clara to know what he meant. He had given up his dreams the day of the accident. He had lost everything, and while she had stayed by his side, taking on the responsibility of caring for him, it felt at times like she was the only one still holding on to the remnants of their life together. "I'm sure you're thinking about how much of your life you've lost," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. She tried to keep her tone neutral, but the bitterness she felt crept in. "I feel it too, you know." Daniel's gaze didn't shift. "I didn't ask for this," he said, his voice flat. Clara swallowed hard, the lump in her throat growing. "I know you didn't." The silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive. The clock ticked in the background, its sound magnifying the gap that had widened between them. Clara's mind began to wander, as it often did these days, to thoughts of the life she might have had if she hadn't devoted herself so completely to caring for Daniel. What had happened to her own dreams? The dream of a fulfilling career, a chance to travel, to experience life outside the confines of her role as a caregiver. The dream of being a wife, not just a nurse. She pushed these thoughts away quickly, as she always did. Daniel needed her, and that was all that mattered. But as she prepared dinner that night, something inside her began to stir, a question she had never dared to ask herself before. Could she continue this way forever? Could she keep sacrificing her own needs, her own desires, for a man who seemed so distant, so lost in his own sorrow? It was a question that had no easy answer, and as Clara set the table, she felt the weight of it settle into her chest. There was no going back. The years had already passed, and yet something in her was waking up, an uncomfortable awareness that she had put her life on hold for far too long. But where could she go from here? Would she have the courage to confront what had become of their marriage? That night after dinner, Clara sat in the living room, unable to focus on the book she was reading. She glanced over at Daniel, who had fallen asleep in his chair, his head tilted back and his breathing shallow. The peacefulness of the moment was in stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. For the first time in years, Clara wondered if she was still in love with him. Not the man he had become, but the man he had been. And if she wasn't, if that love had faded somewhere along the way, what did that mean for their future? The question lingered unanswered in the stillness of their home. The sun had barely begun to rise when Clara Whitaker began her morning routine. The house, once bustling with activity and the hum of conversation, was quiet, eerily so, as if the walls themselves had become weary of the years of silence that had permeated their lives. Clara moved through the house with the practiced ease of someone who had performed these tasks 1,000 times before. The preparation of Daniel's breakfast, the careful measurement of his medication, the adjustment of his chair to ensure he was comfortable for the day. She worked methodically, almost without thinking, as though the motions themselves could silence the doubts that had begun to creep into her mind in recent months. But no matter how busy her hands became, her thoughts remained restless, unsettled. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was about to change, that her world, already cracked and fragile, was teetering on the edge of something she couldn't foresee. The morning was like any other, until Clara stepped into Daniel's study. The study had once been his sanctuary, his place of refuge where he would spend hours reading, working on his projects, or simply thinking. It had been a place of activity, of ideas and plans. But now it was nothing more than a dusty, unused room. Daniel rarely entered it anymore, preferring instead to spend his days in the living room or the sunroom, where he could look out at the garden, lost in his own thoughts. As Clara dusted the shelves, her eyes fell upon an old wooden box that had been pushed to the back of the desk. It was a small, unassuming thing, but something about it caught her attention. She had never seen it before, and when she opened it, she found a stack of papers neatly tied with a ribbon. Her curiosity got the best of her. Clara carefully untied the ribbon and began flipping through the papers. Most of them were old bills, receipts, and other insignificant documents that meant little to her now. But buried within the pile was something that stopped her cold. A letter, sealed with a name written in elegant handwriting. Elena Lambert. Clara's pulse quickened as she held the letter in her hands. The name rang a bell, but she couldn't immediately place it. She knew it wasn't a name from her circle of friends or acquaintances, and yet it felt strangely familiar. The letter was dated from years ago, before Daniel's accident, before everything had changed. It was dated 2 years prior to the crash, back when their life had been normal, or at least as normal as it could be. For a moment, Clara hesitated. There was an instinctive part of her that wanted to put the letter down, to walk away, to ignore the temptation to pry into her husband's past. But the thought of Elena Lambert gnawed at her. She had to know. The letter felt like a key, one that could unlock a door to a part of Daniel's life that had always been hidden from her. The life he had before the accident, before his paralysis. Clara opened the envelope slowly, her fingers trembling as she pulled out the folded letter. As she began to read, her heart sank into her stomach. The letter was written by Daniel, addressed to Elena Lambert, and it was filled with a rawness she had never expected to find in her husband's words. "Elena," the letter began, "I know this isn't right, but I can't stop thinking about you. Every moment we spent together felt like something I had been missing my entire life. You gave me a sense of freedom, of passion, of life. I feel guilty. I feel torn between the life I have and the life I want. But I need to tell you something now. I think I'm going to leave Clara. I know how much that will hurt her, and I hate myself for it, but I can't continue living this lie. I can't keep pretending I'm happy when I'm not. When I'm with you, I feel like myself again. But I also know I can't keep living with this guilt. I don't know how much longer I can live like this." The words blurred before Clara's eyes as she read them over again and then again. She blinked, forcing her vision to clear as though doing so might change what she had just read. But it didn't. The letter was clear. There was no misunderstanding it. Daniel had been planning to leave her. He had been planning to abandon the life they had built together for Elena Lambert, a woman Clara had never even heard of before. Now, for a long moment, Clara simply stood there, stunned, her mind racing. This wasn't supposed to be her reality. The man she had given everything to, the man who had relied on her for so long, had once made plans to leave her for another woman, and all the years of caregiving, of devotion, had been built on the belief that Daniel loved her unconditionally, that she was the center of his world. But now the truth stared her in the face. He had once loved someone else, and maybe he had never truly loved her in the way she had believed. The room felt colder as Clara lowered the letter, her mind swirling. She couldn't process it all. The shock of it was too much. She had always assumed, despite the growing distance between them, that Daniel had been content with their life, content with her. But this letter, this one simple, heartbreaking letter, shattered that illusion completely. It wasn't just the fact that Daniel had been planning to leave her. It was the realization that even now, after all these years, she had never known the full truth of their relationship. How much had he kept hidden from her? Clara's hands began to shake. She had spent years caring for a man who may have never truly been hers. A man who had sought solace in the arms of another woman. A man who had felt trapped, not by his disability, but by the marriage he had been too cowardly to leave. Her heart was racing, the hurt and confusion suffocating her. She tried to steady her breathing, but it was impossible. How was she supposed to face Daniel now? How was she supposed to look at him with the same eyes, the same devotion, knowing what she knew now? As the tears began to fall, Clara realized something deep within her. Her world, the world she had so carefully built around her marriage, and her role as a caregiver, had been built on a lie. Clara Whitaker couldn't shake the image of the letter from her mind. It had taken over her thoughts, overwhelming her with a weight she hadn't been prepared for. The guilt, the betrayal, the sense that her entire life had been a carefully constructed illusion, each piece of her marriage built on fragile foundations, was too much to bear. She could hardly bring herself to look at Daniel that morning despite the usual routine that called for her attention. When she finally made her way to the living room, Daniel was sitting in his wheelchair by the window, the sunlight casting long shadows across the room. His once vibrant blue eyes were dull, a quiet sadness lingering there. Clara, normally so attuned to his every movement, felt suddenly distant, strange in her own home. "Clara," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence that had settled like a heavy blanket between them. "Is everything all right? You've been distant lately. Is something wrong?" Clara swallowed hard, forcing herself to take a deep breath before she could speak. The question was innocent enough, but her heart hammered in her chest. She had spent the last hour trying to compose herself, trying to find the right words to say, but nothing felt like it could adequately convey the storm raging inside her. "Is everything all right?" she repeated, her voice cold and distant, far from the soft tone she usually reserved for their conversations. She didn't care anymore about keeping up the facade. The warmth, the understanding, the mask of perfect care had slipped away the moment she read that letter. "Is everything all right, Daniel? Is that what you've been telling yourself all these years, that everything's all right?" Daniel's brow furrowed, confusion overtaking his features. He shifted in his chair, leaning forward slightly. "What are you talking about, Clara?" Clara took a step forward, the letter still clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't care if he saw it, if he knew how much the words had shattered her. She couldn't hold it in any longer. The truth needed to be exposed, no matter how painful. "I found it," she said, her voice shaking. "I found the letter, Daniel. The one you wrote to Elena Lambert." Her eyes bored into his, her heart thudding in her chest. "The one where you talk about leaving me, about how you were planning to abandon me for her, for someone else." Daniel's face went pale, his eyes widening with a mix of shock and disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was as if he couldn't form the words, as if the truth had left him completely unprepared. Clara continued, her voice growing steadier as the anger rose in her. "How long, Daniel? How long had you been planning this? How long had you been living a lie? I've spent the last 20 years taking care of you, sacrificing everything for you. My life, my dreams, my happiness. And you were planning to walk away, you were planning to leave me behind like I was nothing." She could feel the tears burning at the corners of her eyes, but she forced them down. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble, not anymore. Clara, Daniel said finally, his voice hoarse. I never meant for you to find that letter. I never wanted you to know. He reached out, but Clara stepped back, shaking her head. She didn't want to hear his excuses. She didn't want his apologies, not this time. You never meant for me to find it, she repeated bitterly. But I did, and now I have to face the truth. You didn't just change that day, Daniel. You've been lying to me for years. Daniel's face twisted in anguish, the pain evident in his eyes. Clara, please. You don't understand. After the accident, everything changed. I didn't know how to cope. I didn't know how to be the man I was before. I felt trapped. You were always there, and I just didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to live in the life we had. I wasn't myself anymore. Clara shook her head, her hands trembling as she clutched the letter tighter. So you thought about leaving me. You thought about throwing away everything we had just because you were unhappy. You couldn't even talk to me. You couldn't even give me the chance to help you. Instead, you decided to keep this secret. You decided to keep her a secret. The woman you were planning to start a new life with. Daniel's expression shifted to one of guilt, but there was also something else. Something deeper. He looked defeated, broken, but Clara couldn't find it in herself to feel sorry for him anymore. Not now. I was selfish, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I thought I was doing what was best for you, but I was wrong. I see that now. I never wanted to hurt you. Clara let out a sharp laugh, though it was empty of humor. You thought leaving me would be better for me. You thought that abandoning me, making me care for you for years while secretly wanting someone else, was somehow the right thing to do? Her heart was racing now, the hurt and anger mingling in a torrent that was impossible to ignore. You didn't want to hurt me. You think I haven't been hurt by everything we've been through, by giving up my entire life for you, by watching you slip away emotionally while I took care of your every need? Daniel opened his mouth again, but Clara cut him off. No, Daniel. I've given everything for you. I've been nothing but loyal, nothing but here for you. And you were planning to leave me. You never even considered what it would do to me. You just decided to give up, to walk away from our marriage. For a long time neither of them spoke. The room was thick with tension, the quiet punctuated only by the sound of Clara's harsh breathing. She didn't know what she expected to hear, but the silence stretched out until it felt suffocating. Finally Daniel spoke, his voice low and defeated. I never wanted to hurt you, Clara. I never wanted to betray you. I thought I was doing the right thing by staying with you, even though I wasn't happy. I didn't want to face the reality of it. Clara closed her eyes, tears stinging the corners of her vision. Well, now I have to face the reality of it, don't I? After everything we've been through, after everything I've done for you, I don't even know who you are anymore. The following days were a blur for Clara. After the confrontation, the house had felt like a stranger's home, the air thick with unresolved tension and the weight of painful truths hanging over everything. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't even bring herself to look at Daniel without the image of that letter resurfacing in her mind, replaying the cruel words he had written to Elena Lambert over and over. Each time Clara attempted to carry on with the tasks she had done for decades, feeding him, adjusting his position, offering the comfort she had so long freely given, it felt as though her every gesture was wrapped in betrayal. How could she continue to care for him? How could she be his caregiver, his wife, knowing that he had once wanted to walk away from it all? And yet, despite the devastation, Clara couldn't leave. She couldn't bring herself to abandon him. The years of devotion, the sacrifice of her own desires, her dreams, for this man who had once been her world, it kept her tethered to him, even as the foundation of everything she believed in crumbled beneath her. She woke early the next morning, the weight of the past few days sitting heavily on her chest. The first rays of sunlight were breaking through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. Clara moved quietly, avoiding Daniel's gaze as she began her routine. She couldn't bring herself to speak to him again. The words were still tangled in her throat, a knot of anger and heartbreak she didn't know how to untangle. Clara, Daniel called out softly from the living room, his voice hoarse and uncertain. She stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat. For a moment she didn't respond. It was easier somehow to remain silent, to keep her distance. But then slowly she walked toward him. She had to face this. She had to face him. Daniel was sitting in his chair, looking out the window, his back hunched slightly, as though the weight of his own guilt had bent him inward. His hands rested loosely in his lap, and his eyes were distant. He hadn't been able to look her in the eyes since the confrontation, and Clara could feel the walls he had built between them. I'm sorry, Daniel said quietly, his voice cracked with emotion. I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know why I did it. The letter. It was a mistake. I shouldn't have written it. I should have talked to you. I should have told you how I was feeling, but I couldn't. I didn't know how to be the man I used to be. I didn't know how to be the man you needed me to be after everything changed." Clara stood in front of him, arms crossed, her heart in turmoil. She wanted to feel anger, to feel rage at his words, but the truth was more complicated than that. The hurt and betrayal were undeniable, but there was also a deep, aching sorrow that twisted inside her. The sorrow of losing something she had always held dear. "You think this is just about the letter?" Clara asked, her voice trembling with a quiet intensity. "You think that's the only thing that hurts? It's not, Daniel. It's everything. It's the years I've spent caring for you, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally. I gave you my entire life, Daniel. I gave you my everything, and all the while you were thinking of someone else. You were planning to leave me. You were planning to walk away from the life we built." Her throat tightened, the emotion too much to hold back. "How could you? How could you do that to me?" Daniel closed his eyes, his face tightening with regret. "I was lost, Clara. When the accident happened, I couldn't see beyond the pain. I couldn't see beyond the way I had changed, the way my life had been stolen from me. I couldn't face the reality of it. I didn't want to face it, I wanted to escape." Clara took a step back, the full weight of his words sinking in. There was a deep sadness in his voice, a yearning for something he couldn't have, something that had been lost. But Clara couldn't find it within herself to forgive him. "Not yet, maybe not ever. But you didn't think about me, did you?" Clara whispered, the words leaving her lips like a wound reopening. "You didn't think about what this would do to me. You didn't think about how I was the one who stayed. I was the one who was here, day after day, while you were out there, lost in your own world, looking for someone else to fill the void." For a long time neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them like a vast chasm impossible to cross. Daniel reached for her hand, but she pulled away, not ready to accept the touch that had once been a comfort, now a reminder of all that had been lost. "I don't know how to fix this," Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to make it right. I don't know how to make up for what I've done." Clara met his gaze, her eyes brimming with tears. For the first time in so many years she felt the distance between them, the years of unspoken pain and longing that had built up like an insurmountable wall. "You can't fix this," Clara said, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "Maybe I can't forgive you. Maybe I don't know if I want to. But I'm not going to keep pretending everything's okay. I can't do that anymore." She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the quiet house. She couldn't look back, not yet, not when everything was so raw, so broken. She didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was certain: her life with Daniel could never be the same. Clara's realization that her years of care and sacrifice may have been in vain was the first step toward a future she couldn't yet imagine. The letter had exposed the cracks in their marriage, but it also opened the door to a new beginning, one where Clara would have to rebuild her sense of self, independent of the man she had devoted herself to for so long. Would she stay? Would she walk away? She couldn't answer yet. But one thing was clear: she couldn't stay in the same place, in the same life, and pretend everything was all right. Something had to change. Clara stood at the kitchen counter, her hands shaking as she wiped the countertop for what felt like the 100th time. The house was silent, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the old clock on the wall. The hours had passed slowly since the confrontation, each one dragging behind the next, and yet Clara had barely moved from this spot. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion from the years of caregiving that had weighed on her, it was the emotional toll of the past few days, the realization that her marriage had been a facade, the trust she'd built her entire life around crumbling to dust in an instant. Her mind raced as she stared down at the same spot on the counter. The letter had been the catalyst, the thing that had forced her to finally confront what had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. But Clara wasn't sure if that was enough to tear everything apart. She didn't know if she had the strength to walk away from Daniel after everything they had been through, everything they had endured together. She thought of the life they had once shared, the early days when Daniel was vibrant, full of life, and the future seemed endless. The days they had spent together, traveling, laughing, dreaming. And then the accident, the moment that had changed everything. It had been years since that day, but Clara still remembered it as if it were yesterday. The sound of the car crashing, the flash of headlights, the instant her world had shattered. She had never imagined back then that she would spend the rest of her life caring for him in this way, that her love would turn into an unspoken duty, a responsibility she hadn't asked for but had taken on willingly. And for so long it had felt like the right thing to do. But now Clara wasn't so sure. Now, with the truth laid bare, she wasn't sure if she could keep pretending. Clara's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the phone ringing, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet of the house. She picked it up instinctively, expecting it to be one of her friends or maybe a doctor's office. But instead, the voice on the other end was unexpected. Her sister, Kate. "Clara, are you okay?" Kate's voice was concerned, the edge of worry clear. "I've been trying to reach you all day." Clara let out a sigh, rubbing her temples. "I'm fine, Kate, just been thinking." Kate hesitated before responding. "Thinking? Clara, I know you better than that. What's going on? Is it Daniel?" Clara closed her eyes, the words catching in her throat. She had always been the one to hold it all together, never letting her personal struggles show, especially when it came to Daniel. But now, with everything coming to a head, it was hard to keep up the act. "Yeah, it's Daniel," Clara said softly, her voice strained. "I don't know what to do anymore, Kate. I don't know if I can keep going like this." "Keep going like what?" Kate pressed. "You've been his caregiver for so long, Clara. You've done everything. But if it's too much, it's okay to admit that. No one will think any less of you." Clara leaned back against the counter, her heart racing. "But I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to walk away from him. I've given him my entire life, Kate. I don't know who I am without him." "Clara," Kate's voice softened, "you're not just his wife. You're Clara Whitaker. You're a person with your own life, your own needs. You don't have to lose yourself in taking care of him. You've been a caregiver for so long, but that's not all you are." Clara wiped at the tears threatening to fall. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding in until now, how much she had buried beneath the surface for the sake of everyone else's well-being. "I've given him everything, Kate. And he was planning to leave me, to start over with someone else. How am I supposed to reconcile that with the love I've spent so many years pouring into him?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Kate spoke again. "Clara, I can't tell you what the right thing to do is, but what I can tell you is this. You have to make a choice for you. What's best for you, Clara. Not what's best for Daniel. You've done your part. You've been more than a wife. You've been a saint. But at some point you have to start thinking about your own happiness. You deserve that." Clara swallowed hard, the weight of her sister's words sinking in. It was so easy to lose yourself in the needs of others, to think that giving everything to someone else was the ultimate act of love. But now, standing on the precipice of something new, Clara wasn't sure she could keep sacrificing her own future for the sake of someone who had once loved her, but whose actions had shown otherwise. "I don't know if I can just walk away from him," Clara whispered. "He's still my husband. He needs me." "I know," Kate said gently, "but you need yourself too. And maybe it's time to figure out who you are without all of this. You've spent decades building your life around him. Maybe now it's time to build something for you." Clara's mind was a storm, the swirling emotions too much to handle. She had given everything for so long, but now the question remained. Was it time to let go? Was it time to walk away and start anew, or was she supposed to keep going even if the love she had once felt for Daniel seemed lost? After a long pause, Clara spoke again, her voice trembling but determined. "I don't know yet, but I have to figure it out. I can't live in this limbo forever." Kate's voice was warm with understanding. "Take your time, Clara. You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just take it one day at a time." Clara hung up the phone, her mind buzzing with thoughts and possibilities. For the first time in years, she didn't know what her future would look like. The decision wasn't clear and it would take time. But she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't keep living the way she had been. She had to find herself again. The days after her conversation with Kate passed in a blur of uncertainty. Clara found herself waking up each morning with the same questions swirling around her mind, questions she couldn't answer, not yet. Should she leave Daniel, or should she stay and continue the life she had built for the last 30 years? It felt as if the weight of the world rested on a decision she wasn't prepared to make. Despite the emotional fog she was in, Clara couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in her routine. She had always been diligent about caring for Daniel, feeding him, bathing him, keeping him comfortable. But now, with the knowledge of his betrayal haunting her, she found herself drifting in and out of the motions, her mind elsewhere. At night the house felt colder, emptier. Even the simple act of adjusting the blankets on his bed felt like a chore she had no enthusiasm for. On one particular morning, as Clara went about her usual tasks, she found herself lingering at the kitchen window. The sky was clear, the sun casting its early light across the small garden outside. For the first time in weeks, Clara felt a stirring within her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in so long. Hope. It was a fleeting sensation, easily dismissed, but it was there nonetheless. A small flicker of possibility. She had spent so many years focusing on Daniel's needs that she had forgotten what it felt like to focus on her own. The idea of having a life outside of caregiving, of rediscovering herself, was terrifying, but it was also liberating. Clara knew she couldn't make any decisions in haste. She had spent decades living for someone else. It was time to explore what it meant to live for herself. But how could she even begin? The first step, she decided, was to talk to someone who had always been a steady presence in her life. Her friend, Doris. Doris had been with Clara through all the ups and downs of her marriage, and though she didn't know all the details of what had transpired with Daniel, she could offer the kind of perspective Clara needed. They met for coffee at the local cafe, a quiet spot Clara had frequented for years. The small round table by the window was their usual spot, and as Doris sat down across from Clara, she smiled warmly, but there was a concerned edge in her eyes. "Clara, you don't look like yourself," Doris said, her voice soft but direct. "What's going on? Talk to me." Clara hesitated for a moment, unsure how much to share. But the weight of her emotions was too much to hold back. She found herself pouring out everything: Daniel's betrayal, the letter, her confusion, her sense of loss, and the pressure of making a choice that seemed impossible. "I just don't know what to do anymore, Doris," Clara admitted, her voice cracking. "I've spent 30 years of my life as his caregiver, and now I don't even know who I am without that role. But at the same time, I feel suffocated. I feel like I've given everything, and there's nothing left for me." Doris listened intently, her face filled with compassion. When Clara finally stopped, Doris leaned forward, her voice steady but full of concern. "Clara, I know how much you love Daniel. I know how hard it's been for you, but you can't lose yourself in him. You're still Clara. You're still a person with dreams and desires, and a life that's waiting to be lived. And yes, you've been there for him through thick and thin, but you have to ask yourself, what about you? What about your happiness?" Clara looked down at her coffee cup, the weight of Doris's words sinking in. She had never allowed herself to think that way before. Everything had been about Daniel: the accident, the recovery, the caregiving, the constant focus on his needs. But somewhere along the way, she had forgotten what it meant to live for herself. "You're right," Clara said quietly. "I don't know who I am without this, but I think I need to find out." Doris gave a small smile, her eyes filled with support. "And you will, Clara. It's going to take time, and it's not going to be easy. But you'll figure it out, one step at a time. And remember, you don't have to do it alone. You've got me. You've got people who care about you." Clara felt a spark of something within her, a sense of strength she hadn't known she had. For the first time in a long while, she felt the possibility of a future that was her own. The path wouldn't be simple, and it wouldn't be without its struggles, but Clara knew she had to walk it. She owed it to herself to see what was beyond the life she had known, beyond the pain of the past few days. When she returned home later that afternoon, the house seemed different. It was the same place, with the same memories, but something within Clara had shifted. She no longer saw it solely as the place where she cared for Daniel. She saw it as the place where she was starting to reclaim herself. As she walked into the living room, Daniel was sitting in his usual spot, looking out the window. His face was a mask of guilt and sadness, but Clara didn't know if she was ready to face him yet. She could see the effort he was putting into his apology, into his attempts to make amends, but Clara wasn't sure if she was ready to forgive him. Not yet. But she wasn't angry anymore, not the way she had been before. What had happened between them was painful, yes, but Clara was starting to realize that she had to start living her life again. And to do that, she had to stop looking to Daniel for the answers. She had to find her own path forward. Clara stood still in the doorway, watching him for a moment. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, but it didn't feel as suffocating as it had before. The uncertainty was still there, but it was tempered by a growing sense of clarity, a whisper of hope she hadn't felt in so long. She turned away and walked into the kitchen, a small, quiet sense of determination growing within her. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she was beginning to see that the first step was hers to take. And for the first time in a long while, Clara Whitaker felt like she was moving towards something, not just away from it. Clara woke up early the next morning, the light filtering softly through the blinds. She had barely slept, the weight of the past few days still heavy on her mind, but something about the new day felt different. She had taken the first steps toward reclaiming herself, and though it was terrifying, it was also liberating. Today would mark the beginning of something new. She dressed in the same comfortable clothes she had worn for years, the soft cardigan, the worn jeans, but today they didn't feel like a uniform. They felt like a reminder of who she had been and who she could still become. Clara's hand hovered over her phone for a moment, then she quickly pressed the button to dial Kate's number. The phone rang several times before Kate picked up, her voice thick with sleep. "Clara, what's going on? It's early." Clara smiled despite herself. "Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you, but I just needed to talk. I'm thinking of doing something today. Kate's voice was more alert now, the concern still there but softened with understanding. "What are you thinking of doing?" Clara paused, unsure for a moment. She had told Kate about her decision to start living for herself again, but the reality of it still felt raw. But this was it. This was the moment when she would take control of her own life. "I'm going to visit the old art gallery," Clara said quietly. "It's been years since I've gone. I used to love going there when Daniel and I were, well, when things were different. I think it's time for me to reconnect with something that's just for me." Kate was silent for a moment, and Clara could hear her breathing softly on the other end. Then Kate spoke with a tone of gentle encouragement. "Clara, I think that's a wonderful idea. I know it's been hard, but you're doing the right thing. Go, be there for yourself. I'm proud of you." Clara's chest tightened with emotion, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could start to rebuild the life she had put on hold. The art gallery wasn't far from her house, only a short drive, but Clara took her time, her mind buzzing with a mixture of nervous excitement and apprehension. As she drove, she passed familiar landmarks, the park where she and Daniel had once walked hand in hand, the cafe where they had shared countless mornings together. But today, Clara didn't feel the ache of those memories. She didn't feel trapped by them. She simply passed them, acknowledging them for what they were. Memories that shaped her but didn't define her. When Clara arrived at the gallery, she took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. The scent of fresh paint and polished wood greeted her as she entered, and a wave of calm washed over her. The gallery was quiet, as it often was on weekdays, with only a few other patrons wandering through the exhibits. Clara wandered from room to room, her eyes lingering on the paintings and sculptures that once inspired her. The vivid colors, the sweeping brushstrokes, it all felt like a forgotten world, one that she had left behind when her life had shifted in a direction she hadn't planned. She spent hours there, moving from one piece to the next, each one awakening something deep inside her. Clara had always loved art, but she had put it aside when she became Daniel's caregiver. It had felt selfish to indulge in something that wasn't immediately necessary for their survival. But today, with each step she took through the gallery, Clara allowed herself the luxury of simply being, of experiencing the world on her own terms. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, Clara felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known in years. She wasn't the woman who had spent the last 3 decades consumed by caregiving and sacrifice. She was someone new, someone who could find beauty in the world again, who could take joy in the simple act of living. But as Clara walked toward the gallery exit, a familiar face stopped her in her tracks. It was Elena, Daniel's physical therapist, and as Clara had come to learn, the woman who had been a part of Daniel's secret life. Elena's eyes widened in surprise when she saw Clara, her expression faltering for a moment before she quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Clara?" Elena greeted her, her voice soft and unsure. "I didn't expect to see you here." Clara took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment she had both anticipated and dreaded. She could feel the weight of the unspoken words between them, the tension that had existed since she had uncovered the letter and learned the truth about Elena's involvement with Daniel. "I could say the same," Clara replied, her voice calm but firm. She studied Elena's face, looking for any sign of guilt, any hint of regret. "I didn't expect to see you either." Elena opened her mouth as if to speak, but Clara raised a hand to stop her. "I don't want to hear an apology," Clara said quietly. "Not from you, not now. I just wanted to see you for myself." Elena looked taken aback, but she didn't speak. Clara felt a strange sense of empowerment in the silence that stretched between them, as if she were reclaiming the power she had lost in the years of blindly trusting those around her. "I'm not here for you," Clara continued, her voice steady. "I'm here for me. I'm starting to figure out who I am again. I'm taking back what I've lost." Elena didn't respond, and after a long, tense moment, Clara turned away, walking past her without a second glance. She had nothing more to say to her. Elena had been a part of the past, a painful, complicated part of it. But that was all she was now, a part of the past. As Clara stepped into the cool evening air, the weight of the encounter settled on her. But it wasn't a crushing weight anymore. It was the weight of closure, the weight of finally accepting what had happened and understanding that she could move forward even if the path was unclear. Clara had made her choice. She wasn't defined by her marriage, by her caregiving, or by Daniel's betrayal. She was Clara Whitaker, and the world was still full of possibility. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The decision she had been avoiding for so long had finally come to a head. She had spent decades living for Daniel, caring for him, putting aside her own desires and dreams in favor of his needs. But now, sitting in the quiet of her bedroom, Clara was beginning to realize the painful truth. She had neglected herself for far too long. For the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to truly think about what she wanted. What was it that she needed? She had spent 20 years as a wife, a caregiver, and a companion. But where had Clara gone in all of that? She felt as if she had been swallowed whole by the role of being Daniel's caretaker, swallowed by his pain, his frustrations, his world. And all the while, her own world had slowly eroded away, her dreams, her ambitions, her joys. The woman she had once been, the one who had loved books, art, and adventure, was now a stranger. It was as though she had been living someone else's life, but not anymore. Clara knew deep down that it was time to reclaim her own. The guilt, the responsibility, and the years of selflessness had all led her to this moment of clarity. She needed to make a change. The decision had been brewing for weeks, an undercurrent of thought that she could no longer ignore. When she had visited Daniel last, there had been no warmth in his eyes, no sign of the man she had loved. The physical care he needed had been taken over by the professionals, and it had been clear to Clara that her presence in his life had become more of a habit than a necessity. That evening, as she sat by the window in the dimming light, she made up her mind. She would place Daniel in a professional care facility. It wasn't a decision made lightly. She loved Daniel still, but she had come to realize that love did not mean sacrificing everything for him. She had already given him so much, her youth, her energy, her time, and yet the emotional distance between them seemed to grow with each passing day. It was a truth Clara could no longer deny. This wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself. She had been living in the shadow of a marriage built on lies, deception, and unspoken resentments. For both of them, it was time for a change. The next day, Clara began the practical steps of placing Daniel in a care facility. It wasn't easy. She called the top-rated rehabilitation and long-term care centers in their area, inquiring about spaces and availability. She met with doctors, social workers, and care managers, explaining Daniel's condition and her own situation. She visited each facility, carefully weighing the pros and cons, looking for a place that would offer Daniel the specialized care he needed. Though she knew it was the right choice, every phone call, every meeting, and every step of the process felt like a betrayal. Clara couldn't help but feel as though she was abandoning him, even though intellectually, she knew this was the best option for both of them. But the guilt was heavy. She had been Daniel's caretaker for so long, had promised him she would be there for him no matter what. How could she walk away from that promise? How could she in good conscience choose herself over him? Clara spent the next few days grappling with the emotional toll of the decision. The guilt gnawed at her, deep and persistent. She spent nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining all the things that could go wrong. Would Daniel feel betrayed? Would he be angry with her for sending him to a facility, for no longer taking care of him herself? Would he ever understand? Her mind was a constant loop of second-guessing and self-doubt. But as much as Clara wanted to push the decision aside, something kept pulling her back to it. The part of her that had been buried for so long, the part that yearned for freedom, for peace, for her own happiness, was louder now. She had done everything for Daniel. She had spent decades by his side, watching his pain, caring for him when it seemed no one else would. But it was clear that she couldn't continue living this way. Not anymore. The day came when Clara was finally ready to take the next step. She stood in front of the mirror, looking at her reflection. There was a woman staring back at her that she didn't fully recognize, but she wasn't afraid of her. This was Clara, not just a wife, not just a caretaker. This was a woman who deserved a chance at her own happiness. She picked up the phone and called the care facility where she had found a place for Daniel. With shaky hands, she confirmed the arrangements, scheduled a time to move him in, and arranged for a team to handle the transition. It was done. That evening, Clara stood by the window again, looking out over the quiet neighborhood. Her heart was heavy with grief, but there was something else there, too, relief. She knew that it wasn't the end. This decision was just the beginning of something new for her. For the first time in years, Clara was reclaiming her life. She had given so much, but now it was time to give something to herself. The guilt would come and go, but Clara was learning to push it aside. She knew that this was the right choice for both of them, and though it would be difficult, she believed she could find her way back to the woman she had once been, and become someone even stronger in the process. The next day, Clara visited Daniel in his room, sitting beside him and explaining the decision. She told him that it was time for him to receive the care he needed from professionals who could provide 24/7 support. She explained that for her own well-being, she needed to let go of the role she had carried for so long. Daniel was quiet, but Clara saw something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, or perhaps resignation. It wasn't easy, and there were no words that could make the decision less painful. But Clara knew she had made the right choice, even if it hurt. As she left the room that day, Clara felt a small sense of peace begin to settle in her chest. She wasn't free yet, not fully, but she had taken the first step. It was time to start living for herself again. The first few weeks after Daniel's move to the care facility were the hardest for Clara. She'd expected an emptiness, but she hadn't anticipated the weight of silence that filled every room of the house. Every morning felt like a new beginning, but also like an ending. For so long her days had been structured around Daniel's needs: appointments, care routines, medication schedules. And now there was a void. At first she wasn't sure what to do with the free time that stretched endlessly before her. She'd spent so many years keeping her own needs at bay that it was difficult to know where to start. But one morning, as she sat in the kitchen, a thought came to her. She didn't have to know exactly where to go. She just had to take small steps. Clara had spent hours lost in memories of her past, particularly the things she had once loved. Before she'd married Daniel, she had been an avid painter. She had taken classes, spent hours in her studio, and found solace in the brushstrokes. But somewhere along the way, painting had faded from her life. She had stopped making time for it. She had stopped making time for herself. So that morning she decided to reclaim it. She went to the local art store and picked up brushes, paints, and a canvas. The feeling of the paint in her hands, the smell of the acrylics, was like a breath of fresh air. It didn't matter that she wasn't a professional artist. It didn't matter that her work wouldn't be displayed in galleries. What mattered was that for the first time in a long while, Clara was doing something purely for herself. She painted her first piece that afternoon, an abstract representation of the sun rising over a field, bright, colorful, full of possibility. When she stepped back to look at it, Clara felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in years: joy. The days began to take on new rhythms. Clara reconnected with old friends, those women she hadn't seen in ages, the ones she had neglected when Daniel's needs took priority. She called Martha, her college roommate who lived in a nearby town. They hadn't spoken in years, but when Martha heard Clara's voice on the phone, it was as though no time had passed at all. "Clara Whitaker, is that you?" Martha exclaimed. "I can't believe it, it's been forever." "I know," Clara replied, smiling at the sound of Martha's voice. "I've been a little lost in my own world, but I'm trying to find my way back." They made plans to meet for lunch, and when Clara stepped into the small cafe where they agreed to meet, she was met with the warmth of an old friendship that felt like no time had passed at all. Over the next few months, Clara reconnected with many of her old friends, rekindling bonds that had faded over the years. It was as though, in reuniting with them, she was also reuniting with herself. Clara also took up gardening again, something she had always loved but had never had the time for. She spent afternoons in her backyard planting roses and lilacs, vegetables and herbs. It was a small joy, but one that filled her with pride. Watching something grow under her care, whether it was a plant, a new friendship, or a piece of art, was the most healing thing she could do. The more she nurtured her hobbies, the more Clara felt her confidence returning. She took weekend trips to places she had always wanted to visit but had never had the time for. She hiked through nearby trails, visited museums, and spent quiet evenings in cafes, reading books she had always meant to get to. She no longer felt the weight of responsibility hanging over her, and for the first time in many years she felt a deep sense of freedom. It wasn't long before Clara began to consider the idea of new relationships. At first the thought made her uncomfortable. For so many years her identity had been tied to her marriage. She had forgotten what it was like to be seen as her, not as someone's wife or caretaker. But one evening, as she was having dinner at a local restaurant, a man approached her table. He was well dressed, with warm eyes and a kind smile. He introduced himself as Thomas, a widower who had recently moved to town. They started chatting, initially about the weather, but the conversation quickly turned into something deeper. "Tell me, Clara," Thomas asked as they sipped their wine, "what's something you've always wanted to do but never had the chance?" Clara was taken aback by the question. For so many years her answers to such questions had always been about Daniel, about what he wanted to do, about their shared goals. But this time it was different. Clara thought for a moment. "I've always wanted to travel more," she said, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "But there was always something that came up, always someone else who needed me." Thomas smiled gently, as if he could sense the weight of those words. "Well, there's no time like the present. I think you should do it." Their conversation flowed easily after that, and before long Clara found herself laughing, really laughing, in a way she hadn't in years. There was something light and freeing about the way Thomas treated her, not as someone's caregiver, but as herself. For the first time, Clara realized that there could be more to life than the role she had been stuck in for so long. They began to see each other regularly, exploring new places, attending events, and simply enjoying one another's company. Thomas made her feel like an equal, like she was enough just as she was. It wasn't that Clara was rushing into a new relationship, but rather that she was learning to embrace the idea that she was worthy of love and affection outside of her role as a wife. Despite the joys that began to fill her life again, there was still a part of Clara that struggled with anger. Anger at the life she had lost, at the years of self-sacrifice, and at Daniel for the lies he had told her. She knew it wasn't just his fault, it was her own too. She had allowed herself to be defined by him, by his needs, and had neglected her own happiness. The process of forgiveness was not an easy one. It didn't happen overnight. But one evening, as Clara was sitting quietly in her garden surrounded by the blooms she had nurtured, she realized something. She had to forgive herself. Forgiving Daniel would come later, but forgiving herself for losing her way, for allowing her identity to be swallowed by the role of caregiver. That was the first step. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill her lungs. She wasn't perfect. She had made mistakes. But that didn't mean she couldn't move forward. Clara had spent so many years living for someone else. Now it was time to live for herself. The day Clara decided to visit Daniel felt like the closing of a long chapter, a chapter she had lived for too many years. And yet it was the hardest decision she had made in the last several months. Her thoughts had been swirling ever since the moment she made peace with her decision to move on with her life. She had worked hard to rebuild, to reclaim the woman she once was, but one thing lingered, the need to say goodbye. It wasn't about hatred or anger anymore. That had faded long ago, replaced by a quiet acceptance. She no longer felt the need to carry the weight of their shared past, but a small part of her wanted closure. Daniel was still in the same care facility, a place that over the years had become more like a second home to him than she ever had been. She had come to terms with that too. He was well cared for, and while she had been his everything once, she was no longer the person he needed in that way. As Clara drove to the facility, a calm washed over her. She hadn't expected this moment to be so peaceful, so resolute. It was as if every step she had taken in her life over the last few months had led to this one. It was time to let go, for her, for him, and for their memories. The facility smelled the same, of antiseptic and faintly of flowers. She entered the familiar lobby and signed in, feeling as though she was stepping back into another time. The receptionist smiled at her, and for a brief moment, Clara wondered if they recognized her, if they remembered how she had once spent every day here, tirelessly caring for Daniel. But today she wasn't the woman who had done everything for him. Today she was just Clara Whitaker, ready to embrace what was next for her. The walk down the long corridor to Daniel's room was quiet. Clara's footsteps seemed louder than usual, each one echoing against the sterile walls. She had been here countless times before, but today felt different. When she finally reached his room, she paused. Through the window in the door, she could see him lying in his bed, a shadow of the man he once was. He looked peaceful, but there was something about his stillness that made Clara's heart ache. She had taken care of him for so long, first with love, then with a sense of duty, and finally with a quiet, resigned grace. But it was time to let go. She knocked lightly on the door before entering. "Clara," Daniel said, his voice soft, almost surprised. His eyes were tired, but there was a flicker of recognition in them. He was still the man she had known, the man she had loved, but in many ways he was a stranger now. "Hi, Daniel," Clara said, her voice steady, though it trembled slightly. She had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was here, the reality felt far more emotional than she had anticipated. There was a long silence between them. He didn't ask about her life, about her new routines, about what had brought her here. Instead, he simply watched her, waiting. "I'm here to tell you something," Clara said, sitting down beside his bed. "I've made peace with everything we've been through, with everything I've given to this marriage. And I forgive you, Daniel. I forgive you for the lies, for the secrets, for the years we spent living a life I thought was real." Daniel blinked, processing her words. It was clear that he wasn't fully able to grasp everything she was saying, but Clara didn't expect him to. This moment was for her, not for him. "I've spent so many years focused on you, on what you needed, on making sure you were taken care of. I've given up pieces of myself, Daniel. I've forgotten who I am, but I've learned something. I've learned that I'm worth more than the life we built together. And I'm moving on. I'm reclaiming my own happiness. I hope you understand." Daniel's hand twitched slightly, but Clara didn't think he could truly comprehend the depth of her words. That was okay. She wasn't seeking his understanding. She was seeking her own. With a soft, steady breath, Clara stood up. I'm moving on with my life, and I hope you find peace, Daniel. I really do." She walked toward the door, feeling the weight lifting off her chest with every step. When she reached the door, she paused for a moment and looked back at him. He was still lying there, but she could see the faintest glimmer of something in his eyes, a recognition, perhaps, of her departure. Or maybe it was simply the look of a man who had long since given up on trying to understand the woman he had once known. Clara didn't need to say anything else. She opened the door and walked out. The drive back home was different this time. She didn't feel burdened by the weight of her past. She felt lighter, as if the years of caregiving and sacrifice had been peeled away. Layer by layer, she was free now. Not in the way she had imagined freedom in the past, but in a new, quiet way. When she arrived home, Clara walked straight to her garden. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the flowers she had planted in recent months. There was something so symbolic about the way these blooms had flourished, just as she had, slowly, patiently, and steadily. Clara knelt beside the bed of roses she had carefully cultivated. She ran her fingers over the soft petals, marveling at the new growth, the promise of things yet to come. The flowers were a reminder that life didn't stop when one chapter closed. It was just a new beginning. She stood up, looking out over the horizon, feeling a deep sense of peace settle in her chest. For the first time in years, Clara felt hopeful. She knew there was still so much life ahead of her, so much to explore, to love, and to experience. And as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara smiled. She had reclaimed her life. It was hers again. Clara's journey is a reminder that it's never too late to reclaim your life. After decades of selfless devotion, she found the courage to let go of what no longer served her and embrace a new chapter of personal growth and peace. Have you ever felt like you lost yourself while caring for someone else? Are you ready to take back control of your life just like Clara did? Clara's story shows us that true closure comes from within. It's about forgiving the past and embracing the future with hope. What's one thing you've been holding on to that you're ready to let go of? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe now for more empowering stories and inspiration to help you create your own new beginning. Let's journey forward together.